the success of Redbeard in 1965, Kurosawa would spend the next decade struggling with a series of rough productions and box office flops, such as Tora Tora Tora, Do Desu Kaden, and Desu Uzala. Because of this, his reputation was damaged, and he was now perceived as a senile old artist who had lost his talent and was only interested in making difficult and expensive projects, causing him to fall into a depressive state. With his usual medium of creative expression limited, Kurosawa returned to his old hobby of painting in order to continue to record and express his ideas. What this led to was a series of beautiful and vivid storyboards that would act as the blueprints for his later filmography and would even be exhibited in art galleries in years to come. When he finally received financial support from a studio, Kurosawa used his $6 million budget to put these storyboards into motion, and the result was a 1980 film Kagemusha. Kagemusha follows the story of Shingen, a warlord in 16th century Japan who arranges for an unnamed thief identical to him in appearance to replace him after his death and continue fighting his war for him. It was a turning point in Kurosawa's career, as while it was not his first film in colour, Kagemusha has a much more vibrant and deliberate use of colour than his last two films, which is mainly found in the diverse colours of the costumes. It's clear when comparing his storyboards to the finished product that Kurosawa was not just painting them in imaginative ways for the sake of them being paintings. He wanted to purposely give the film a painterly and artistic effect. Kurosawa would gravitate to expressionism over realism from this point in his career, and with the addition of colour, he became a lot more experimental and creative in his approach to illustrating stories. And one way in which he achieved this was by developing on his signature use of the weather setting the tone and conveying emotion in a scene. When the thief is banished from the castle, the rain plainly suggests a somber feeling, but with colour, or rather the lack of it, we see the emotion of the shot in a lot more detail, as the blue tint of the rainfall washes out the colours and adds to the melancholic tone. More remarkably is this renowned scene in which the sky is wrapped in a crimson red and flashes a disorientating blue to illustrate the fear the other clan leaders feel when they see that Shingen is supposedly alive. But Kagemusha was also a turning point in Kurosawa's career for another reason. Whereas his previous historical samurai films had been stories of honour and heroism, with intense action-orientated sword fight sequences, Kagemusha instead focuses more on the drama and tension of a large-scale war, fought with battalions of rifles and charging horses. The result of this change is that Kagemusha has a darker and morbid tone to his typical samurai films. There's a sense of optimism and saving grace missing in Kagemusha, as the film instead centres on the horrors and depravity of war, and in no technique is this message more potent than Kurosawa's use of shadows and the colour black.
動かざること山のごとしその山のようなお方ゆえ我らは親方様をお山と申しております。なるほど。
Shingen, the leader of the Takeda clan, describes himself as a mountain in relation to his role among his army, implying foremost that he is a pillar of strength for them to look up to. But on a deeper level of analysis, this metaphor of a mountain relates to the way that he casts his shadow of influence over everyone around him, and shows that the identity of each character is determined by their relationship with Shingen. For example, this scene showing Shingen's army after his death is blacklit, and the army is cast in darkness not just to depict their doubt on whether their leader is still alive, but also to show that Shingen still holds influence over them in death, and that their entire identities are defined by Shingen. Likewise, his younger brother and first body double Nobukado is separated by Shingen's shadow in the opening scene, signifying he is literally living in his brother's shadow. Shingen's son, on the other hand, is often seen in well-lit environments with little shadow work, as he is desperate to escape his father's influence and make a name for himself. But most importantly, this repeated use of shadows represents the control Shingen has over the characters. Shingen's shadow suppresses all of the colours in the film, and when it is revealed that Shingen is dead and his son can take control over his army, he leads them into a shadowless battlefield that leaves the once restricted colours open and exposed, reflecting his son's freedom, but also showing us the unfiltered and chaotic colours of war in the final scene. It's important to note, however, that Kurosawa did not simply darken colours as shadows to create a pessimistic image for the film, but rather for them to encourage reflection on the habits of man.
っていうのはさ、だってもうこ 本当の大昔から同じことばっかりしてるわけよ。なぜそれを繰り返しているのかね。人間っていうのはこういう絶望的な状態になってるんだぞと、これを突き抜けるためにはどうしたらいいのかっていうことを考えようじゃないかっていうことを僕が言ってるんであって、それはペシミズムでも何でもないよって言ったんですよ。
Kagemusha is an impressive feat in filmmaking that would justly restore Kurosawa's reputation as a filmmaker, but it's evident in retrospect that Kurosawa was using this film as a stepping stone for his next project, a project that would go on to become what Kurosawa said was his best film. Ran, meaning chaos in Japanese, was released 5 years after Kagemusha and is an adaptation of Shakespeare's King Lear, telling the story of the fictional warlord Hidetora, who divides his kingdom up and leaves it to his 3 sons, only for 2 of them to betray him in war over the throne, while the 3rd banished son works to save his father. With Kagemusha being a critical and box office success in both Japan and abroad, as well as winning the Palme d'Or at Cannes, Kurosawa had restored his reputation enough to gain an $11 million budget to create what would be his last samurai film and the most expensive film ever made in Japan at the time. Kurosawa continued to storyboard Ran in a similar style to Kagemusha, painting the storyboards as he wrote the film for 5 years, and once again these storyboards match up nicely with the film's shots, continuing this deliberate painterly effect. The use of colour in Ran is boldly simple. The colours are high in both contrast and saturation, and since many of the scenes have more balanced lighting and exposure than Kagemusha, the colours of the film are far more noticeable and eye-catching to the audience. The boldest example of this is the brazen colour coding of the characters. In the introductory scene we see Hidetora in a divine white, implying authority, while his sons are divided up into the triadic primary colours red, yellow and blue, foreshadowing their adversity through the fact that they are at opposite ends of the colour wheel. Additionally, the side character of the jester bears all of the aforementioned colours on their clothes, to represent that they hold no loyalty to a particular side and are detached from the approaching drama. It's possible that Kurosawa intended for these colours to be metaphorical, since white is made up of all colours, and when split produces each colour, similar to how Hidetora splits his kingdom among his sons, whose colours are the products of his white. These bold hues are not necessarily restricted to the costumes, however. Take for example the scene of Hidetora being banished from his fortress, which is one of the most iconic and striking shots of the film. We see the white Hidetora in the centre of the frame, who is a fish out of water amongst the overcast and dull background, engulfed by hostile oceans of yellow and red hues at either side of the frame, while the orange fire rages on in the castle above, which, interestingly, is created through combining red and yellow. It can even be argued that some of the most memorable iconography of the film are the shots where Kurosawa subverts the high contrast and saturated colours, and instead variates with gentler, low contrasting colours and dimmer lighting, such as this shot of Hidetora's face illuminated by a single weak flame and submerged in darkness, or the repeated sunset shots which use weaker lighting and a soft, quiet orange tone to elicit a private and dreamlike feeling. However, one of the most interesting details of Ran is simply that the entire colour palette is incredibly broad, evenly using every colour on the wheel, to the point where if you skim through the entire film, it's nearly impossible to get a feel for an organised colour scheme, because the film is constantly changing its colour palette from scene to scene, a subtle detail that earns the film its meaning of chaos. After Ran, Kurosawa wanted to move away from historical dramas, and in his old age he began to explore more philosophical and abstract concepts. He began to reminisce about his life and explore his memories, and so in 1990 he made Dreams. The film is a series of 8 disconnected stories, all of which are based off of dreams that Kurosawa experienced throughout his life and recorded in a dream journal. It stars an actor portraying himself as the protagonist in each dream. Once again, the use of colour is diverse and gorgeous, and like Ran, it is impossible to establish a general colour palette for the film since the colour scheme changes so much. However, Where Ran changed colours with each scene to mimic the chaos of the story, Dreams only changes its structure of hues with each section. In the first few Dreams, which Kurosawa recalls from his childhood, the colour palette is wide and makes use of every colour on the wheel, much like how a youthful child would paint a picture with every colour available. Then, as they continue, we see a more disciplined colour palette like the monochromatic light blue of the Blizzard Dream, or the analogous dark blacks and reds of the Soldier Dream, both of which suggest a transition to maturity for Kurosawa's character. Next, however, we see more chaotic and evocative palettes, such as the bizarre and uncomfortable colours of Mount Fuji in red, which are reminiscent of the nightmare scene in Kagemusha, or in the Weeping Demon scene, which is stained with a hazardous red and green, possibly suggesting a more anxious and existential time period in Kurosawa's life. Finally, in the last dream we see a return to the expansive colours of the first dreams, reflecting the cyclical message of life that the ending pushes, although this time with the anchor of a dominant green, creating a peaceful sense of growth that someone at the end of their life might feel. The lighting of Dreams is also ambitious. Whereas Kagemusha suppressed its colours with shadows and Ran accented its colours with even lighting, Dreams manages to strike a balance between the two. Kurosawa often uses shots with low-key lighting in order to bring the audience's attention to a specific colour, often when that colour is being used as a motif for the sequence, but also uses more blown-out lighting to show off a magnificent array of colours when he wants the scene to feel more like a spectacle. One of the most interesting examples of the film's balanced lighting is during the tunnel dream. After Kurosawa's character emerges from the dark abyss of the tunnel, the lighting is uniquely balanced. It's not quite dark enough to be nighttime, not quite bright enough to be the daytime, and it's missing the orange tint of dusk or dawn. Because of this use of balanced and undefined lighting, there's an appropriate ethereal setting to the shot, and the audience is thus transported into the twilight between the physical world and the afterlife where the dream takes place. Kurosawa also utilises colour coding in Dreams more than he did in Ran. Where Ran used colour coding to mainly help distinguish characters and give the film a theatrical tone, Kurosawa experiments with the audience's understanding of colours in Dreams to a much larger extent. For instance, in the Cherry Orchid Dream, the first thing the audience sees is Kurosawa's character entering the foreground of a dimly lit room, while the bright pink cherry tree is illuminated in the background. This combination of a bright hue spotlighted by the lighting records the colour pink in the audience's mind as important, so that later on in the dream we pay more attention to the appearance of pink, which acts as an anchor among the ocean of colours. Opposingly, the Weeping Demon Dream utilises this technique in the opposite way. The dream starts with a lack of colour, seeing Kurosawa's character wander a lifeless sea of greys, so that when the green of the weeds or the hazardous reds appear at the end, they feel more disharmonious and unnatural. But by far the most interesting use of this idea of coding the audience's understanding of a colour is during the Mount Fuji in red scene. While we see Kurosawa's character, a mother and a child left stranded among ruins, a scientist begins to explain exactly what each of the approaching radioactive clouds will do to them.
あの赤いのはプルトニウム239。あれを吸い込むと1000万分の1グラムでも癌になる。黄色いのはストロンチウム90。あれが体の中に入ると骨髄にたまり白血病になる。紫色のはセシウム137。生殖腺に集まり遺伝子が突然変異を起こす。つまりどんな子供が生まれるか分からない。
When the clouds start to engulf the characters, the audience's understanding of the colours have been recontextualised by the scientist, and a simple combination of coloured hazes now becomes a terrifying thought as we watch the characters desperately try to fight them off to no avail. There's something about Dreams that feels very conclusive. The abstract and grand subject matter of the film, combined with the fact that it's technically an autobiography by Kurosawa, make it feel like he planned it to be his last film. But Kurosawa would go on to make 2 more films after Dreams, Rhapsody in August and Madadayo, and they both still follow this trend of painted storyboards converted into vibrant colours for a painterly effect. It's no secret that Kurosawa is best known for his earlier work like Seven Samurai and Rashomon, but his later work in colour isn't always as revered or discussed on the same level, which is unfortunately due to the damage his reputation suffered between Redbeard and Kagemusha. While his black and white films are still masterpieces in their own right, it's easy to see that colour broadened Kurosawa's creative options. He didn't just use colour to make a shot look pretty or eye-catching, there's an intentional application of colour to all of his films after Redbeard. whether that be to help illustrate a narrative, convey the emotional state of the character, to help the audience understand a motif or message, or simply just to help evoke an emotion. It's this use of colour to such an artistic and narrative extent that makes you wonder what an auteur like Kurosawa could have done with colour had he had access to it sooner.